Look at this, the precision. Good morning. It's a beautiful spring day here in Delaware, northern Delaware. And flowers are blooming, the sun is shining, and all the grown-ups are out of town, but we're having the party anyway. So I'm glad you could be here. My name's Rebecca Fisher, and on behalf of First Unitarian Church of Wilmington, Delaware, I welcome you to our hybrid worship service. Welcome to those of you here in the sanctuary. Welcome to those of you online watching the live stream, and welcome future people watching the video playback. Feel free to arrive here as your whole self. Now, I'm not going to put on a bathrobe like Ed Scott did to illustrate how comfortable you can be here in the sanctuary, but we are Unitarian Universalists, so you can wear blue jeans. If you want, that's perfectly fine. Just come as you are, bring with you all your identities, bring your ideas, bring your thoughts, your emotions, all your worries, bring your triumphs, bring your love, and bring your questions. As Unitarian Universalists, we value and encourage the individual search for truth and meaning while we work in community to build a more compassionate, more just world for all. To learn what's happening here at First Unitarian, do sign up for our e-news. And if you've been reading our e-news, you will know that next Sunday, after church from noon to 1:15, April 2nd, we will have a discussion of the Article 2 proposal. If you haven't read it, the expectation is that you will attend this meeting after you've read this packet. So you can pick it up from the table back where the name tags are. Or if you're online, you're not going to be in the sanctuary before next week, you can find it on our website. You can find it on the uua.org website, the Mother Church organization. And you can, print out a PDF or just read it online. We will provide childcare. So that's one less reason not to come. To not avoid it. Come. It is if you haven't read them yet, it is quite a reimagining of our principles. But I think it's healthy for organizations, and especially spiritual organizations, to review what it is that we stand for and what it is we aspire to represent. So, noon to 1:15, April 2nd, so a week from today. Now, I had to use the search feature to find it, mind you. It's not that easy to find, but if you put in Article 2, Unitarian, you'll find it. No. Now let us prepare our hearts and minds for worship. We're lucky enough to be joined today by Seth Hammonds, offering his beautiful guitar and voice.
In every sea there's a mouth of a river where waterfall ridges flow down. Why do they cry? No one knows why. And in every mouth there's a word of forgiveness that melts all the ice to the ground. Why do you sigh? I don't know why. Why does the sky fall down like pouring rain? Let it flow again. And in every soul is the need to grow older, to speed up the passing of time. I don't know why, but it makes me cry.
So I call us into worship this morning with the words of Reverend Leslie Takahashi. We gather as many drops. We gather as many drops, each winding our own path down life's surface and ruts. Here we pool together as a single body, flowing together for a time. Together we are a stream, at times a river. For with our shared force, we can travel towards oceans of meaning and seas of connection.
Lighten the chalice. Yeah. If you have a chalice at home, I invite you to join us here by lighting it with these words by the Reverend Gretchen Haley. There is nothing you need to bring with you to be welcome here. No right beliefs or proof of citizenship. No eternal optimism or clarity of conviction. No boundless courage or endless expertise. You do not need to know what you bring here or how you will solve that problem you are turning over and over and over in your mind. Your bills do not need to be paid, and your checkbook can be a mess. Your children may have been up half the night, Your hearing aids may not be working, and your knees may be creaking. You do not need to be already perfect or even halfway to belong in this circle where grace meets us where we are, but does not leave us as it found us. And now please rise in body or spirit and sing number 298, Wake Now My Senses. A couple adjustments. We are going to be singing a cappella. So in the spirit of John's sermon theme, I invite you to listen first so you can hear what notes I'm singing and how fast I'm going, the pitch and the tempo. And so I'm going to sing a couple measures and then I'll bring in like this, okay? And we are only singing the first 3 verses. So it's a lovely Irish melody. Perfect, thanks. Listen. Wake now my senses and hear the earth call. Feel the deep power of being in all. Keep with the web of creation your vow, giving, receiving as love shows us how. Wake now my reason, reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim who quests for the true. Honor the beauty and wisdom of time. Suffer thy limit and praise the sublime. Wake now, compassion, give heed to the cry. Voices of suffering fill the wide sky. Take as your neighbor, both stranger and friend, praying and striving their hardship to end. Good job. Then we'll just send some get well wishes to Ann Turner, okay, who would have been accompanying us on the piano if she could have. Oh, please remain standing because we have our unison affirmation. So sorry for the upping and downing. Please join us now in affirming our mission. First Unitarian Church of Wilmington is a beloved community that nourishes minds and spirits, fights injustice, and transforms the world through loving action. Now please be seated. From joyful noise, we now move into silence. So please join me in a guided meditation. I invite you to become aware of your body as you sit in the chair or wherever you find yourself. Maybe you're standing, walking around your home, listening. If you wish, you can direct your attention to the places where your body feels supported by the furniture and the floor, those points of contact with the earth. Relax whatever you can, your face, your jaw, your shoulders, your hands. If it feels right, lower your gaze, soften your focus, or close your eyes. I'm going to give you a couplet and then a shortened version of the couplet that you can breathe to. And we'll breathe in and out a few times, and then I'll come in with the next couplet. At the very end, I'll invite the bell. Breathing in, I'm aware of my body. Breathing out, I smile to my body. Aware of body, smile to body. And if you forget the couplet, just breathe in and out. Breathing in, I am aware of sounds around me. Breathing out, I am open to all I hear. I don't need to categorize the sound as pleasant or unpleasant, loud or soft. I just hear it. Aware of sounds, open to sounds. Breathing in, I'm aware of my thoughts. Even in this short moment of silence, distractions enter in, thoughts arise. Breathing out, I let my thoughts be without trying to control them. Aware of thoughts, letting be. Breathing in, I rest in the here and the now. Breathing out, I let go of expectations and attachments. Resting in the present moment, letting go. Each week in our worship service, we take time to attend to the concerns that arise within us. Concerns for ourselves, concerns for those we love, concerns for the world. We also take a time to offer them to the collective heart, our congregation, to hold tenderly. So take a moment in silence first to listen, to discover what concerns are arising within you. And in a moment, I'll invite you to speak them out loud. If you're online, you can write them in the chat. So what are the concerns that you are holding in your heart this morning? Peter Ostergaard, David Fisher. May all these names spoken and unspoken. Find some peace and healing.
If variety is the spice of life, then repetition is its sustenance. That's the insight underlying our spiritual practices. These practices can take a myriad of forms: daily affirmations, walks in the woods or in your neighborhood, cooking, meditation, and so many more. They help us settle our minds and bodies, do the work of healing when needed, help us change when we need to adapt, and prepare to fully live the moments of our lives. Today we're focusing on practices that affect our inner voice. I highly recommend the practice of meditation for deconstructing self-awareness and reflecting on the nature of your inner voice. By inner voice, I mean ideas that are expressed in language as opposed to ideas that might be a picture in your mind's eye or feelings or sensory memories. In my experience, the way these thoughts are constructed is the same as the way you create spoken language. You just don't have the added task of using all the muscles that you use to speak. So your inner voice is speaking to you, and to you only. Our inner voice also tends to be repetitive. If we're lucky, it's there to offer words of encouragement, positive visualizations as we plan for the future, solace when we need it, constructive criticism that can benefit all of us. Sometimes I will notice that my voice is narrating my actions, like I'm the hero in my own action story. This comes in handy when you're digging deep for that last mile up the mountain climb. Sometimes we're not so lucky, and our inner voice repeats things that are less helpful. It may be reminding us of something that is causing excessive anxiety. Sometimes our inner voice can be downright cruel, filled with excessive criticism or even self-loathing. That's probably Cinda telling me something about the stream. Hopefully everything's okay up there. One of the goals of a spiritual practice is to work more of the constructive language into rotation. Our principles are a good starting point for a spiritual practice that can transform your inner voice. Allow me to illustrate with my experience of our first principle. We affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I started attending First U regularly in the fall of 2009. My wife, Amy, and I had very little prior experience with organized religion. We came to UU like many young families, hoping to raise our children in the context of a community that thought deeply about the needs of its members in all phases of life and would allow us to express our own beliefs. Those of you that know Amy may share my suspicion that her somewhat sudden openness to religion, organized religion, may have been an elaborate plot to get me and the kids out of her hair on Sunday mornings. In any case, in that first year, I came to this very room most Sundays. In fact, I tended to sit about 3 or 4 rows from the back on that side. Reverend Josh Snyder was our new minister, so it was his voice that I heard most frequently in the pulpit. After a number of services, something very surprising happened. Some Sundays, while I was listening to Reverend Josh's sermon, I would find myself tearing up for no apparent reason. Usually this would happen when Reverend Josh was sharing a story of his own. This was completely surprising because it seemed to be so spontaneous. I had no clear sense of what was triggering it. Upon reflection, I came to understand that I was crying because I was feeling something I'd been missing. I was starting to feel like I belonged here in a way that I did not elsewhere, and maybe had not belonged for a long time. In other contexts, I was accepted because of the work I did, the way I played a sport, or because I was doing my part to make sure people were having a good time. But here I was part of a community that proclaimed right there in its first principle the worth and dignity of every person. Almost all of my life, I've struggled with negative self-images. In order to get on with life, we need to put these thoughts out of mind and even build a wall around them. As I listened to our minister share some of his humanity and reflected specifically on our first principle, I was almost unconsciously wondering if that meant I too could be worthy. Simply to ask the question was to open wounds long scarred over. I was not ready to revisit all the psychological battles I had lost or the battles that had left me with these wounds, but simply considering that I might be able to reclaim some of this lost territory was unleashing a flood of emotions. It was giving me strength to tone down some of that negative self-talk and some new language to add to the favorite themes of my inner voice. It's amazing how transformational this one principle has been for me. Initially, it threw me a lifeline by challenging me to revisit long-standing assumptions about who I was. We might call this a healing transformation. But that was only the start. There are at least 2 more transformational opportunities associated with this principle. Some of you who are lucky enough not to have these self-doubts may never interact with the first principle in the way that I did initially. It may come as no surprise to you that you're worthy. But you may have had the more typical experience of finding it challenging about your view of how you see other people. I grew up in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia suburbs in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. You may have heard of people described as WASPs, or a subculture described as WASPish. WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I don't have time to deconstruct this idea this morning, but it also carries hints of arrogance and a lack of charity on an interpersonal level. And that does capture some of the culture of the people that I grew up with. In this culture, it was hard not to develop the belief that people are not worthy until they have somehow proven themselves to be so. I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I had carried this attitude with me to some degree all the way until I found First U. One of the first practices I remember adopting was to meet new people with no assumptions other than I would like them and focus on trying to see them unfiltered through my preconceived notions. This took a lot of work, but I did become more friendly towards newcomers and much less prejudiced against strangers in general. Both transforming how I see others and the healing transformation involved in changing my inner dialogue hearing the words as they came to mind, challenging them to step back and make way for other responses. The last point that I'd like to make about the first principle is that beyond self-healing and transforming how we see others, there's a third transformation there to be had by anyone who's interested. It comes from reflecting on the word all. Are Unitarian Universalists really prepared to ascribe worth and dignity to all people? This question can be called the Hitler problem, because you can guess whose name comes up typically the first time people start probing the potential limits of this idea. I've heard people I respect on both sides speak on both sides of the issue. For me, to stop short of including all is to shy away from one of our missions as Unitarian Universalists. To transform the world through loving action, we must strive to understand the breadth and depth of human drives and experiences. Otherwise, we're embracing pale shades of humanity. You may have heard that the Unitarian Universalists, as a denomination, are currently reviewing our principles. Since we will be discussing the proposed changes as a congregation next Sunday, I thought it would be helpful to show you where our first principle, in a modified form, shows up in the proposed changes. If adopted, our first principle would now read, equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. It's interesting that by asserting that everyone has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness, the authors have solved the Hitler problem. It does not actually claim that everyone has inherent worth and dignity. Presumably, Hitler chose not to exercise his right to so flourish. But is there a cost to solving that problem? Does this language have the power to encourage us to struggle with our understanding of human nature? Would someone suffering from a kind of brokenness read this and hear that they, too, are worthy? Sometimes I think that maybe Reverend Larry would have been wise to put into my contract that at least once a year I would have to stand up here, because then I would be sure to understand what the AV team puts the folks up here through. In my personal reflection, I just shared how I experienced the transformational power of our first principle, how it changed the words that come to mind as I meet people and made me a better person. In the winter of 2013 to 2014, I went on an unexpected personal journey that was deeply introspective. It again featured our principles and sources and how they worked their way into my inner dialogue, but this time I discovered some questions that I would like to share. Just a little more background on where I was spiritually at the time. I'd been coming to First U going on 5 years. I was very active in the congregation. I was co-teaching a CYRE class, active in a connection circle. I also joined the Denominational Growth Committee, which led to serving as one of our representatives to the Delmarva cluster of UU congregations. These two groups gave me the opportunity to work side by side with so many members that I grew to admire. Vivian Gray, Barbara Kroll, Joan Priest, Paul Pinson, Reverend Richard Speck, David Shepard, Carl Toll, as well as many inspirational volunteers representing the other Delmarva Peninsula UU congregations at our cluster meetings. Through these committees, I was channeling a lot of my time and energy into cluster-level programming, including events like Beach Day and a fall retreat at Camp Taqua. These retreats were initially focused on our First U community. The last retreat, we had a proper cluster-level retreat. It was a weekend-long retreat. As the name implies, we spent a lot of time in our Denominational Growth Committee meetings talking about how to grow our congregations. We even had a forum at our last cluster retreat where we invited attendees, including several ministers from our cluster congregations, to discuss the topic. Whenever this subject comes up, the answers tend to focus on working harder, making our congregations more welcoming, more dynamic, engaging even more fully in the work of social justice. Even when prompted, I've found that groups are reluctant to consider that there might be some problem with the framing of our religion itself. Every UU that has ever tried to explain our religion to someone else knows full well that this is harder for us than it is for many denominations. But you'll not find general agreement that this is harder than it should be. We mostly accept that the challenge goes hand in hand with the joys of pluralistic religion, a religion that encourages communities of many beliefs rather than a single belief defined by a creedal statement. But after a few years of struggling with being UU from a marketing perspective, I was becoming more convinced that we needed to fix the framing of our religion itself. And I'm certainly not alone in this opinion. In 1979, when Reverend Eugene Pickett ascended to the presidency of our national governing body, the Unitarian Universalist Association, he said, "The deeper malaise lies in our confusion as to what word we have to spread. The old watchwords of liberalism, freedom, reason, and tolerance, worthy though they may be, are simply not catching the imagination of the contemporary world. They describe a process for approaching the religious depths, but they testify to no intimate acquaintance with the depths themselves. If we're ever to speak to a new age, we must supplement our seeking with some profound religious finds." 5 years after he gave this speech, we adopted the current version of our principles and sources as at the annual gathering of UU congregations that we call our General Assembly. This version represented a significant expansion and transformation of the set of 6 goals that were adopted by the Unitarian Universalist congregations in Article 2 of the 1961 bylaws of the UUA. So in 1961, we had 6 goals. It was also the first time that these ideas, now in 1985, expressed as our 7 principles, well, 6 until 95 when we added our 7th, and our 6 sources. And this was the first time that these ideas and some of their historical context had been more publicly proclaimed as a joint covenant of UU congregations. My inner marketer liked this trend from 1961 to 1985. In the personal reflection on our first principle that I just shared, I illustrate what transformative power could be packed into a simple, clear statement like our first principle. As a whole, our principles should get high marks for concepts, but maybe mixed reviews for power of language. And that's okay, because they're intended to be a work in progress. We're expected to review and revise Article 2 every 15 years or so. As many of you probably know, we're in one of these review periods right now. It's been going on for over 2 years, longer if you include proposals for changes to specific principles and a proposal to add an eighth principle, which were made at recent General Assemblies. Personally, I would be happier with an even more deliberative process. Why not give ourselves 7 years leading up to a revision to deeply reflect on what has worked and what hasn't in our current language? Reflect on how we and our cultural context may have changed, and take plenty of time to craft new language. In any case, my concern for the success of UU is a relevant background for the story I'm about to share. In the winter of 2013 to 2014, I was struggling with depression. I'll spare you the causal details. Suffice to say that I was having a kind of midlife crisis, exacerbated by providing care for my mother, who was suffering from dementia and frequently talked of suicide. Depression is not a common experience for me, and it can be hard to recognize for the person who's trapped therein. But mine was profound and undeniable. I was so laid low that I could barely make coffee in the morning. I could not keep track of how many scoops of grounds I had added to the basket. Many mornings I would dump grounds back into the bag and start over, simply unable to count to 6. Unable to count to 6 without my mind wandering back to one obsessive, painful thought or another. A quick public service announcement. If you feel you might be struggling with depression, don't be shy about seeking help. It's very tempting to think you should be able to power through it, but why not save yourself some precious time and consider that your condition may be affecting others around you as well. And so ends my public service announcement. Now back to my story. I had a desperate need to find hope, so I turned my gaze to my newfound religion. I was not going to be satisfied with knowing that individual leaders of our congregations were full of hopeful vision. I wanted to know that we, as a denomination, were, as Reverend Pickett suggested, in possession of some profound religious finds. I was seeking both a message of hope and hope for our denomination. So every night for several months, I would wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning and ask a question about UU, often a question about the principles or the sources, searching for insight, searching for something like the good news of Unitarian Universalism. This might sound impertinent, foolish even. Why would I think this territory was not already well covered? And why would I think, if there was something to be discovered, that I might find it? The answer was that I had already heard at least 3 different UU ministers talk about the good news of UU, and each one gave a completely different answer. If there was no one right answer, why couldn't there be more to say on the topic? The first sermon I heard was by Reverend David Pyle, who argued that our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, was, in fact, the good news of UU. The next sermon was by Reverend Roberta Finkelstein, who was serving here as our developmental minister. Reverend Roberta gave the generally accepted tenet of liberal religion, that revelation is not sealed. Or, as James Luther Adams puts it in the first of his 5 smooth stones of religious liberalism depends on the principle that revelation is continuous. Our religious tradition is a living tradition because we are always learning new truths. I think of that as a kind of meta good news. It does not give us anything specific to celebrate, but it does offer some hope for the future. So what started as me lying in bed in the middle of the night, feeling deep despair, casting about for some hopeful thought to hold on to, turned into one of the most exciting adventures of my middle age. A typical session would begin with a question. For instance, what assumptions underlie our 4th principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning? And then I would think, well, To hold that principle, you have to believe that we are in some sense free. It's difficult to prove that we're free, so we would have to include that as a shared belief of UUs, that humans are in some sense free. And then I would be off for a couple of hours, asking more questions and exploring the answers. As this went on, night after night, throughout the winter and into the spring, I became no less fascinated by the ideas I was exploring as the way they were created. Because I was not talking to someone or writing them down initially, I could focus on the nature of these thoughts in my consciousness. I came to think that thought is intertwined with how we represent it. In the case of thoughts connected to perceptions like images and sounds, we can conjure images and sounds in our minds. While some of this creative process must include recalling memories, it seems pretty clear to me that we can use memories to amalgamate new compositions. For much of my adult life, creating meant loading a model of a computer program into my mind, something akin to an architect imagining a building with all of its structures and choices of materials. I also played musical instruments and had a facility to play music in my mind. I could play back fairly long pieces of music in an immersive experience. I could also compose music this way. Often when asked why I don't still play music, I say something like, it was too frustrating not to be able to play the music that I heard in my head. But a more accurate explanation would be that music was an escape, a source of comfort. I would play music to drown out the negative thoughts that predominated in my consciousness. In school, I was considered to have a strong facility for language. But creative attempts at language would often trigger stronger, automatic, negative narratives in my mind. Rather than conquer this problem, during college, I found it easier to focus on other material. I settled into a career solving manufacturing challenges with software and hardware. Anytime I wanted to settle my mind, I could focus on a work problem and be fully absorbed in solving it. So part of what was intensely exciting about my early morning explorations was that I was experiencing creative language as if it was for the first time. It seemed almost miraculous. I would ask a question or reflect on an observation and then listen to the answer. I was in a kind of flow state where for many minutes at a time, I was just listening to an uninterrupted discourse on the question. It did not even feel like I was directing it. I began to understand what writers mean when they talk about their muse. I even wondered how someone reflecting during prayer could feel that the voice responding might not be their own. I'm very grateful that First U and Unitarian Universalism exists. What I've been describing was the beginning of a new and exciting way for me to explore the world. It certainly has changed my thinking. This process did not single-handedly free me from my depression, but it helped me regain a sense of hope. I did also seek professional help, and with time was able to get back to what I think of as normal. So what did I find in my search? Allow me to draw to a close with a few of these observations. Remember, I was looking for the good news of Unitarian Universalism. Setting aside the two answers already covered, our first principle and the non-specific assertion that revelation is continuous, our sixth principle looks like a good candidate. The goal of community with peace, liberty, and justice, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. I'll confess that the first time I read that principle, it conjured an image of a comic book hero and the Justice League. But what if we as a community really hold that vision? Even with the linguistic hedge of its achievability, the goal of world community, that's a radically hopeful principle. I actually went to Reverend Roberta at the time to see if I could get on the schedule to preach on the subject. But before I committed to a date, I asked one more question, which was, are we as a community actually invested in this principle? I decided I wasn't sure, so I went back to pondering. While thinking more about how revelation is continuous, I wondered if we were not giving ourselves full credit for some of the specific finds that we as a denomination had actually discovered. So here are a few that also changed me. Our fifth principle, the right of conscience and the democratic process within our congregations and society at large. A commitment to democracy is scary. This principle binds our fate to democracy in a way that most denominations are not bound. I love that our congregation and most UU congregations are very active in the political process. Members lobbying for just laws and spearheading get out the vote drives. I hope that our commitment to this principle might move us to the even harder work of mending the torn fabric of our society and, in some cases, considering compromise to strengthen our democracy. To paraphrase John Stuart Mill, there is no policy that is not improved when its proponents consider the truths of its opponents and the truths of its opponents that the proponents deny. And I'm going to pause and let you unpack that for a minute, because that is the original language is even harder to follow, but there is a profound truth contained in there. There is no policy that is not improved when its proponents consider the truths of its opponents that the proponents deny. So in other words, when you're fighting for a policy, there is a tendency to ignore the truth of the other side as you're trying to get your policy passed. In the midst of the fight, you end up, there's basically many aspects of truth are a casualty of that battle. And if we instead could think and more deeply and listen to what the opposition is saying, we would end up making better policies. Our fifth source, humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of mind and spirit. How extraordinary that we explicitly call out science as a source. While not entirely unique among religious denominations, could we be the denomination that takes on the challenge of educating ourselves and others about how to think about science? Wouldn't we all benefit from a clearer understanding of the humble nature of the pursuit of scientific knowledge? Consider that the most certain thing in science is still just a theory. All scientific facts are understood to be contextual, meaning that they're not facts at all in the sense that we think of facts, merely observations. And most importantly, science does not invalidate other ways of knowing. It is simply a way to come up with better and better descriptions of ourselves and our world, as measured by whether the description helps us predict what will happen next. Ultimately, I settled on our commitment to pluralism, the coexistence of many beliefs, as the good news of UU. This is captured in our statement of sources, which identifies the many sources of our faith tradition. I find the balance between our fourth and fifth principles particularly powerful. Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. That last line is fascinating because I had to research idolatries of the mind, and good grief, Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon. It goes back 400 years to a man who essentially identified what is only very recently been codified by social psychology. And the idolatries of the mind are really just our intuitions, our built-in assumptions or tendencies to see certain patterns in the world. And in some case, they work for us. In some case, they work against us. And 400 years ago, Francis Bacon was thinking about this and pointed out that our mind is not always helpful in perceiving truth. In just about every creed-based faith community, there are those that believe in the precepts of their faith and those who have some doubts. I feel for the people who live on in their community in spite of their doubts or divergent beliefs. Of course, in some cases, they may have no choice or may be choosing family and friends over spiritual authenticity. Still, this seems like a sad situation. In UU congregations, members can stay in community with each other and still be free to find what makes their life meaningful for them. Rather than feeling coerced, they will find support in following their own unique path. So several years later, I was heartened to hear Reverend Pamela Watt also call out this quality of UU as our good news. She described it as being in our DNA to navigate different faith traditions and individual beliefs. One test of whether this really is an essential idea is to ask, well, if UU were to disappear from the face of the earth, would we be okay as long as some group of congregations were to continue this work? And the answer for me is yes. And this brings me finally to our own Reverend Dr. Larry Pierce, who has the idea that were it to be introduced in the next version of the covenant of our UU congregations, brings me to our own Reverend Dr. Larry Pierce, who has an idea that were it to be introduced in the next version of the covenant of UU congregations, could be a singular catalyst for growth in the coming decades. If you were to attend a newcomer orientation with Reverend Larry, you would hear him explain that rather than principles, we should think of the 7 as practices. Now, Reverend Larry has so many brilliant ideas that I'm not sure this one has had a chance to bubble to the top priority for him. But think about it. The fact that a creedless religion has principles is confusing. The second meaning of creed in Merriam-Webster's online dictionary is principle. The reason that our principles, individually or as a group, don't amount to a creed is that they only imply beliefs about human nature. What do you think of this concept of taking the insights into human nature that we currently express as principles and rephrasing them as practices? Could this add clarity to how we explain ourselves to others? I do hope that what comes next for our practices and sources upholds our strengths and builds on them with profound statements that reverberate in our inner voices until we fill the world with words that inspire and sustain us. Words worth repeating. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for giving us so much to think about and for showing your devotion to the individual search for truth and meaning. I might add that for those of you who are watching this who aren't well known to our congregation, John is the leader of our audio-visual team. So, First You's got talent. When I first began training to be a worship associate, I had some reservations about the terminology worship because I'm a lifelong atheist, so you don't have to be a member of this community. Most of us aren't, but I am. I well, to be accurate, by the age of 11, I was an atheist. I don't know what I thought in my first decade. But I was offered, I went to Hebrew school. I liked learning the language and the Hebrew language, and I liked the stories. And I definitely balked at the theology and would be translating everything into something I could stomach in my head. And my parents, of course, wanted me to take the training for bat mitzvah. And I'm like, no. I didn't say BS. I don't think that was in my vocabulary when I was 11, but pretty much I just knew that it was inauthentic of me to do that. But when I trained to be a worship associate, Larry, he's here, even though he's not here. We keep talking about him. He said that the word worship comes from the same root as the word worth. So worship is what we are choosing to lift up, what we are choosing to hold up to the light and sort of exalt. So, what do you believe is worth it? Is this community worth your support? So, if you think so, then please support the work of this congregation and the health and well-being of our staff and our facilities and our programs by donating to this congregation. You'll find at home, you'll see, while the offertory music plays, you'll see the 4 fundamental ways to give up on the screen. And for those of you in the sanctuary, we have a basket at the back on the table with the name tags where you can put your donations. Our stewardship campaign for the upcoming fiscal year, Generating Our Future Starts Now, is the moniker, is still open. Please, if you haven't made a pledge, avoid an uncomfortable phone call and make your pledge now. Through our website, you can pick up a form in the office. You can talk to someone in the office. But please also give generously to continuing to generate our present. So please join me now in dedicating our offering. To the work of this congregation, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action, we dedicate our lives, and these are offerings. What a gift. Thank you, Seth. It's time to extinguish our chalice as we say these words by Wendell Berry. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know, well, just had to let that sink in, and that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. So please rise in, oh, is it time for that? Or, oh, you got something to say. Sorry, I told you we're out of town today.
Into the World Singing by Don Skay Cooley. Let us go out into the world singing. Let us go out into the world singing songs that proclaim liberty, songs that turn ashes into garlands, songs that bind up the afflicted and those who mourn, songs that, like oaks, have roots that go deep and stand strong. Let us go out into the world singing. We know these songs. They vibrate through time in our very souls. They are the songs that give us life. They are the songs that give us meaning. They are the songs that give us purpose. Now, it is our turn to take these life-giving songs out into the world. Let us go now singing these songs. With these voices deep and strong, and may the world join in praise and in celebration and in love. Amen.
So please rise in body or spirit or both and sing Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is number 149 in your hymnals. And Maestro, can you give me a D? Thank you. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers died. We have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered, out from the gloomy past, till we now stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us far, Keep us forever in the path, we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. Thank you. Good.